When I first bought the house in the neighborhood, I thought I was making the right choice. It was a quiet place with nice yards, kids riding bikes, and families who waved when you drove by. I wanted to make the house truly mine, so the first project I planned was replacing the old, drafty windows. They rattled whenever the wind blew, and you could feel cold air seeping through in the winter. I didn't want anything fancy, just energy-efficient windows that looked the same as the originals. Following the rules carefully, I filled out the HOA request form, included the contractor details, and waited for their approval. A month later, I received the signed approval letter. It felt like a green light to move forward, and I hired the contractor they themselves had listed on their recommended sheet. Everything was done neatly, and the new windows matched the house so well that even neighbors complimented how good they looked. I thought the HOA would be pleased, maybe even grateful that I was improving the property. Instead, a few weeks later, I opened my mailbox to find a letter that made my stomach drop. The HOA was fining me, claiming my windows were not approved. At first, I laughed, thinking it had to be a mistake, so I pulled out the signed approval and called their office. But instead of fixing it, they told me the approval was invalid. The excuses kept shifting. One day they said the wrong board member signed it. Another day they claimed the paperwork was outdated. Then came the notice, a $12,000 fine. I stood in shock holding that paper, unable to believe they wanted me to pay that much for windows they had already signed off on. That's when I knew this fight was only beginning. The fight with the HOA quickly became more than just a disagreement about windows. It turned into a constant, draining battle that touched every part of my life. At first, I thought it would be simple to clear up. I had proof, after all. But each time I called or wrote a letter, they twisted their words, acting like I was the problem for even questioning them. Soon the fines started piling up. They said the $12,000 balance was growing with late fees and interest. Their letters arrived so often that checking the mailbox became something I dreaded. My wife would sigh every time she saw the HOA's logo on another envelope, and my kids started asking why I was always upset after reading the mail. I decided to face them directly at a board meeting, hoping that showing up in person would make a difference. Instead, I was humiliated. Jacobs, the HOA president, cut me off mid-sentence, saying the board had final authority. He smirked while telling me that fighting the HOA was pointless. I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept calm, reminding him that I had the signed approval in my hand. He didn't care. His only response was that the issue was closed, and that payment was expected. Walking out of that meeting, I felt like I had no voice in my own neighborhood. But I wasn't ready to give in. At night, I spent hours online, reading about other homeowners who had been bullied by their HOAs. Some lost everything, but others fought back and won. I started keeping a binder with every single document, every letter, every threat. What Jacobs didn't know was that I wasn't the type to quit. If he wanted a fight, I was ready to give him one, no matter how long it took. The lawsuit process was like stepping into another world, one filled with delays, paperwork, and endless meetings with my lawyer. He warned me from the start that HOAs rarely backed down, and Jacobs in particular seemed determined to crush me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had my binder of evidence, and I knew the truth was on my side. When we started digging into the HOA's records through discovery, that's when things took a surprising turn. Buried in the stacks of documents was proof that Jacobs himself had signed the approval for my windows years earlier. His own signature, dated and clear as day, was on the very form he now claimed was invalid. I remember staring at that page in disbelief, anger and relief washing over me at the same time. But that wasn't all we uncovered. My lawyer found patterns in the HOA's finances that didn't make sense. Payments were being made to companies tied to Jacobs' friends, and even relatives. Landscaping bills were triple the normal cost, and maintenance contracts were being handed out without bids. It was as if the HOA was his personal bank, and the homeowners were his unwilling customers. Suddenly, my case wasn't just about windows anymore. It was about fraud and abuse of power. The more evidence we gathered, the more aggressive the HOA became. Inspectors started showing up at my house, measuring fences, checking my yard, and leaving violation notices for the smallest things. One letter claimed my trash can was too visible from the street. Another said my mailbox was an inch too tall. Each of those notices went straight into my growing file of retaliation. The harder they pushed, the stronger my case became. Deep down, I knew Jacobs was starting to realize he had picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. When the court date finally arrived, it felt like the weight of 5 years of stress was pressing down on my shoulders. I walked into the courtroom carrying my binder, thick with papers and tabs, while Jacobs strutted in wearing a smug grin. He had his attorney beside him, sharp suit and briefcase in hand, as if this was just another easy win for them. But the moment the judge asked for documentation, I knew the tide was about to turn. My lawyer slid the signed approval form across the table, and the judge held it up. "Is this your signature, Mr. Jacobs?" he asked. Jacobs hesitated, shifting in his chair before muttering that it was, but claimed it was never official. My lawyer didn't waste a second. He produced the meeting minutes from that year, clearly showing the board's unanimous vote to approve my request. Jacobs' face turned red, and the smirk vanished. The judge's tone grew sharper with every excuse Jacobs tried to throw out. "So let me understand," the judge said. "You approved the windows, then fined him for installing them exactly as approved?" Jacobs' lawyer stammered, trying to argue technicalities, but the judge wasn't buying any of it. The courtroom grew tense as more evidence of retaliation and harassment was presented. The stack of violation letters I had saved showed a clear pattern of targeting. Then came the financial review. The judge ordered an examination of the HOA's accounts, and when the details were read aloud, you could feel the room shift. Misused funds, sweetheart contracts, inflated expenses, all linked back to Jacobs. For the first time, Jacobs sat in silence, his confidence drained. It wasn't just about my windows anymore. His entire scheme was starting to collapse in front of everyone. When the verdict was finally announced, I almost couldn't believe my ears. The judge ruled completely in my favor, declaring that the $12,000 fine was invalid, and ordering the HOA to reimburse me not only for legal fees, but also for the stress and harassment I had endured over the years. The total came to just over $75,000. I sat frozen for a moment, then let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "You won. It's over." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Jacobs shifting angrily in his chair. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight. The same man who had mocked me, laughed at me during meetings, and acted untouchable, was now being forced to face the consequences of his own actions. Neighbors who had come to watch the trial looked at me with wide eyes. A few even patted me on the back as I walked out, whispering that they wished they had done what I did years ago. For once, the power Jacobs held over everyone was broken, and people could see he wasn't invincible. A month later, the victory became even sweeter. The HOA mailed me a check for the full amount, but because Jacobs was still president, he had to be the one to sign it. I imagined him sitting at his desk, pen in hand, fuming as he wrote my name on a $75,000 check. When it arrived in the mail, I pinned it to my fridge and left it there for a week before cashing it. Every time I passed by, I couldn't help but smile at the bold black signature of the man who once told me I would never win. Now his signature was proof that I had. Cashing that check felt like the final step in closing a chapter one had been trapped in for years, but the aftermath of the case rippled through the neighborhood in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, neighbors who had once kept their distance were stopping by to talk. People who used to avoid HOA meetings were now eager to attend, encouraged by the fact that someone had finally stood up to Jacobs and won. Some even admitted they had been fined or harassed for small, ridiculous things but were too afraid to fight back. My victory gave them courage, and it felt good to see the community slowly realize that Jacobs wasn't the untouchable tyrant he pretended to be. Jacobs, on the other hand, was a shell of the man he used to be. He no longer strutted around the neighborhood barking orders or handing out threats. At meetings, he sat stiffly in his chair, silent while the rest of the board tried to keep control. The financial investigation the judge ordered had opened a can of worms, and now county officials were asking more questions about the HOA's money. Rumors spread that Jacobs might face personal liability for mismanaging funds. For a man who loved power, watching him shrink into the background was almost better than the check I received. At home, life began to feel normal again. My wife smiled more. My kids no longer asked if we were going to lose the house, and I could walk to the mailbox without feeling dread. The binder I had carried for years sat on a shelf, a reminder of the fight I endured. Part of me felt exhausted, but another part felt stronger, knowing I had proven that even one homeowner could take on an entire HOA and win. As the months went by, the neighborhood started to shift in ways I hadn't imagined. The once feared HOA board meetings turned into crowded gatherings where homeowners actually spoke their minds. People began questioning fees, demanding transparency, and asking where their money had really been going. For the first time in years, the board couldn't hide behind closed doors. My case had opened everyone's eyes. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us realizing we had rights that Jacobs had been trampling on for too long. Jacobs tried to maintain his position, but his grip was slipping fast. The smugness he once carried was gone, replaced by short, defensive answers whenever someone asked a tough question. When the financial audit results were made public, showing years of overbilling and questionable contracts, the anger in the room was unmistakable. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke up, their voices sharp with frustration. It became clear Jacobs couldn't weather the storm much longer. Meanwhile, I started feeling like life in the neighborhood was finally becoming what I'd hoped for when I first moved in. Instead of living under constant pressure, there was a sense of community forming. People stopped by to thank me for standing up, saying I had given them the push they needed to demand better. For a long time, I had felt like I was fighting alone, but now I could see it had created something bigger than myself. One evening, as I walked past Jacob's house, I noticed his yard was dark. No porch light on, no sign of his usual presence. For years he had been the loudest voice, always reminding people who was in charge. Now he was just another neighbor fading quietly into the background, his reign nearly at an end. Not long after the audit results were revealed, the neighborhood finally reached its breaking point. A special meeting was called to vote on whether Jacobs should remain HOA president. The turnout was unlike anything I had ever seen. Dozens of homeowners crowded into the clubhouse, their voices buzzing with frustration and anticipation. For years, Jacobs had ruled by intimidation, but now people looked him in the eye with anger instead of fear. I sat quietly near the back, not needing to say much. My case had already spoken louder than any words I could add. When the vote began, Jacobs tried to defend himself. He claimed the fines and fees were necessary for keeping the community in shape, but no one was buying it anymore. People shouted back, demanding answers about missing money and inflated contracts. His once loyal allies on the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unwilling to take the fall with him. When ballots were cast, the result was clear. Jacobs was removed as president by an overwhelming margin. The room erupted with clapping and cheers, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt free. Walking home that night, I couldn't help but smile at how different everything felt. The air seemed lighter, the tension gone. Neighbors waved and stopped me to say thank you, calling me the reason change had finally happened. I didn't see myself as a hero, but I knew I had stood my ground when no one else could, and that had sparked something bigger. The following weeks brought even more change. The new board promised transparency, fair treatment, and no more petty harassment. For the first time since moving in, I felt like this was the neighborhood I had wanted all along. And the man who once tried to crush me was nothing more than a bad memory. Life after Jacob's removal felt almost unreal at first. The community that had once been tense and divided slowly began to come together. Without his constant stream of fines and threats hanging over everyone's heads, people seemed more relaxed. Yards looked better because homeowners actually wanted to improve them, not because they were afraid of being punished. Block parties and cookouts started popping up again, and neighbors who once avoided each other now shared food, stories, and laughter. It was as if the neighborhood had been holding its breath for years, and was finally free to exhale. For me, the biggest change was the peace inside my own home. My wife no longer jumped when the mail arrived, worried another fine was waiting for us. My kids finally stopped asking if the HOA could take our house away. Even simple things like sitting on the porch in the evening felt sweeter now that the battle was behind us. Every glance at those windows, the ones that started it all, reminded me of what I had endured and what I had overcome. The new board invited me to attend meetings, not as a defendant or a target, but as a valued homeowner whose input mattered. They asked for ideas on improving the neighborhood and actually listened. At first, I kept my distance, weary from all the years of fighting, but slowly I started to engage. It felt good to be part of something positive rather than locked in constant conflict. Word of my case spread beyond the neighborhood too. A local paper even ran a small piece about the lawsuit and the changes it sparked. I never wanted attention, but it felt good knowing that maybe my fight would inspire others facing the same kind of abuse. What had once felt like a personal nightmare had turned into a victory for many. Looking back now, it's almost hard to believe how something as simple as replacing a few windows could turn into a 5-year war. What began as an ordinary home improvement project had dragged me through stress, threats, and endless battles, but it had also shown me the importance of standing up for myself. If I had paid that $12,000 fine just to make the problem go away, Jacobs would still be running the HOA like his personal empire, and my neighbors would still be living under his shadow. Instead, one stubborn decision to fight back exposed the truth and gave the whole community a chance to breathe again. The $75,000 check was satisfying, but in the end, it wasn't about the money. What mattered more was knowing I hadn't let them break me. Every time I look at the signature on that check, I remember the nights I almost gave up, the meetings where Jacobs tried to humiliate me, and the inspectors who left bogus violation letters at my door. All of that pain was worth it to see justice finally win. Today, the neighborhood feels alive in a way it never did before. The new board focuses on improvements that benefit everyone, not just a select few. Homeowners speak openly, decisions are fair, and no one lives in fear of petty fines. I often see kids playing in the street again, neighbors chatting in driveways, and it reminds me why I moved here in the first place. As for Jacobs, he eventually moved away, unable to handle the loss of power. His departure marked the true end of that chapter. For me, it was proof that sometimes the smallest battles can uncover the biggest truths. And sometimes, just one voice refusing to be silenced can change everything.